stuffed up for some reason.
All the emotions.
I'm very verklempt. I'm so. Yeah.
I fall down to my knees. Eyes are raised to the sky.
Welcome to Assumptions. This is the podcast where two friends, a Christian and an atheist, try to understand the other's worldview. My name is Kyle. I'm the atheist.
Yeah, you are. And my name's Daniel. I'm the Christian.
That's right.
Is that good or bad?
I will be smited by the end of this episode. I am very sure of it.
That's right, and I will be stoned to death by the angry hordes who hate my beliefs. Yeah.
Yes. This is episode 2 of our second season.
That's right.
This is all about relationships, love, community, and all its many forms. Today we're talking about sexuality, the hot button topic, the one that maybe people are a little bit curious to know how Daniel and I are going to talk about this.
Yeah.
Before we do talk about it, though, I think it's time to hear some points of view from other people that we were able to talk to.
That aren't male and white?
Correct.
Well, some are, so.
Some are.
But
Listen,
not all are.
listen, it's hard to find non-white males, okay?
Just, if you know of any, please email us and let us know.
Please forward them to us.
Lo and behold, I'm running out of room. 'Cause I got no...
Author Joy Beth Smith.
Yeah, and I think that, and I have a friend of mine who identifies as asexual, and we've actually had a lot of discussions about it, and it's actually something so much greater than just like a lack of attraction. It's actually like there's not only just like a lack of attraction, there are also like people who are only attracted like once they form like deep relational bonds. You know, it actually has nothing to do with the physical. You know, and so it's
Sapiosexual,
like,
I think is what they're called.
Right. And so like that kind of thing too, where you're like, it's actually like or you have like one person that like once you, I mean, really it's something along the lines of like the one, you know, where it's like, I have made a deep relation and I want to spend my life with that one person just as a person, you know, and like maybe we'll have sex, I guess.
Barry Danylak.
Certainly, there are two prominent purposes of sex. The first is the most obvious of all, which is, of course, procreation. There's the biological need we all have for reproduction of the species, and of course, you know, that kind of goes without saying. The second, and I think equally important, but often more powerful for people, is what I would call, and I think it's been also described this way through the history of the church, is the unitive purpose. The unitive purpose being that sex is what brings a couple together deeply and intimately, and it's the powerful social and physiological glue for the relationship.
Lish Veldhuijzen.
The majority of us have come from sex, like we're born from that. That's our vitality in life. So I think sex is to reach that vitality within yourself and also with the person you're experiencing sex with. I think sex is to heal. I think sex is to celebrate. I think sex can be to rejoice in life. It's also just to connect, and I don't think it's a bad thing if sometimes we use sex to have intimacy, and it could be a wrong thing. I think it's just another expression.
Nick Taniguchi.
Safe sex, know what you're getting into, understand the principles of consent. Oh my God, consent is so important. And teaching yourself the nuances of it, it can be a really good thing. I highly recommend watching shows like Sexplanations with Lindsay Doe and shows like that. It's really good. It feels really good, and sex feels really good. It feels nice to like know what I'm getting into, and I highly recommend that for anyone. It feels so much safer and more comfortable knowing the ins and outs of sex than being in the dark.
Rabbi Seth Goldstein.
Also the idea that sex is pleasurable and that it's a part of who we are. It's a part of our desires, our needs to be sexual beings and to engage in sex. And even from earliest teachings, we see that I'm thinking about after the Bible, some of the later Jewish teachings that promote the idea of sex, even so much so that sex on the Sabbath is seen as a special blessing, because you're taking this idea of the day of rest, a sacred day, that you're augmenting it with pleasure. And I think that it's not to say that there aren't norms and guidelines around sex, and that it's not sex just for the sake of sex, but I think we think about sex within the context of loving, respectful relationships.
Okay, Daniel, I think it's time for us to delve into this topic a little bit more, because to play off the title of our podcast, I have a few assumptions of what I think you're going to probably say about this topic.
Sure.
And you probably have some assumptions that I'm going to say about this topic.
Maybe.
And so I think it's time to find out if we are right or not.
Yeah.
In your worldview, Daniel, is sexuality important?
Sure.
In
do
what
you
way?
mean? So I guess, can we clarify this first?
Yeah,
before
let's
we go in?
clarify.
Yeah. So there's two things I want to kind of talk about on this
Mm-hmm.
episode. The purpose of sex itself, the act of intercourse.
Right.
What does that do to someone? And then a sexual identity. Because I think when people talk about sex or sexuality, it can mean a lot of things. So I just want to clarify that before we dive in. There's two different aspects to that.
Let's unpack that here a little bit more. So what is sex? Let's maybe answer that question.
Right. The actual
first.
act of sex then? Or?
Yeah, let's talk about that from our two
Intercourse.
worldviews.
Right.
Like the actual intercourse act itself.
Sure.
I think definitely when I was growing up, there was this perception of what it was. I think still it wasn't out in the open. I didn't really know much about it. I had obviously sex ed in school, so I knew the basics of what was involved with it.
I Wikipedia'd it, so.
Oh, good. Just like a normal millennial would
That's
do.
right.
And when I still believed in God, at least when I was in like middle school and high school, I was just really scared about it because again, I was coming to terms with my own sexuality, which I believed was wrong, and then trying to deal with who was I attracted to and the actual sexual act itself. All of it was messed up with me being very guilty and just unsure of myself and just really scared about everything. I think how I would answer that question now is that there's two different purposes for sex in and of itself. Okay. I think there is one just for the gratification, the feeling good of the act itself. Pleasure. But I think a deeper thing for that is to actually have a interaction with somebody that you deeply respect and love, and having an interplay between the two of you, a way to express that love with a sexual partner.
Right. So it's expressing love to. That's interesting because I agree with both of those as a Christian, right? Like I believe that sex does give pleasure and it's a good thing. God created it.
Sure.
But then I also believe
God was a dirty boy.
But I mean, in the sense that it's part of. I'm reading a book right now that I really love called The Supper of the Lamb, which is by this Anglican priest who's an expert chef, and he just talks about.
Sounds sexy. Yeah.
Sounds really sexy, yeah. But he has this whole thing where he talks about how things in the world exist, and obviously it's a fallen world, so you got to be careful in terms of what that is. But the good things in the world exist because we're made in the image of God, and we find them good because He finds them good. Mm-hmm. There's a reason kids prefer candy. Like candy's a good thing, like just on that level. But
having too much candy can have a bad effect.
Yeah. But the point being is that we find pleasure in sex because we were made to.
Right.
Like it's just the way it was. But then there's a second point, which is it's designed to bring you closer and to have an intimate relationship with someone. And so it's interesting that we both agree on those things, and yet I feel like there's a lot of disagreements.
I think the disagreements are going to be placed when it is an appropriate time to have sexual relations with a person.
Totally.
And I have no problem with people engaging in sexual acts like outside of marriage or even outside of a committed relationship.
Right. Where's I do?
What has to be very clearly stated, and I think this is what we're seeing now in this new sexual expression of our culture, is that there has to be that understanding when you're going into it, is that if one person is going into that relationship thinking this is going to lead to something else, and the other person is thinking, no, this is like a one-time only thing, that can be very damaging to people's psyches, and that can be really a bad experience for both parties involved. There has to be that openness and that talking about what's going to happen before the actual act
Well, and
happens.
you can also see how the understanding of sex being whatever, whenever you want, can lead to sexual abuse that we see a lot of.
Absolutely.
Not that didn't exist before that was the cultural norm, but I think especially in this 2017, the era, who knows when this will end, but that era of Me Too is that people take that for granted.
Right.
And it's tricky to kind of maneuver the way through that when sexual norms have changed.
Yes, is the quick answer.
That's a different conversation.
That's a completely different conversation, which I don't know if we want to go down.
I know.
We might circle back to that.
Sure.
I think absolutely something that is true now that I don't think is really all that different, at least for the last 30, maybe even 40 years, which is if you look at media, read books, like a lot of the drive of the classical male hero is to either get the girl or have sex with somebody. Like that is really the driving motivator for a lot of the media that is kind of consumed as we grow up.
Right. Back to the Iliad.
Well, I was going to say,
right? Like it's been part of
I was going
human
to say
nature for a long time.
Porky's, but I guess the Iliad will do. But I think because we have placed that level of, I don't know, we've put sex up onto this pedestal so much that when we're conditioned to think that is the one and only thing that we should be striving for. I think there can be a lot of misunderstanding about what sex can be, what it is, and then that's where the shame kind of starts to come in, because we think that we're all supposed to be great at it the first time we have it. We think that that's everyone else is having it when they're probably not. And that we are somehow lesser than if we haven't had it yet. Like there's all this cultural stuff that gets thrown at us within this idea.
There's a point that I want to bring up there.
Yeah.
Before I do, I just want to go back to the idea of puberty and because one of the things that I want to say about sex is that because we sex itself is not evil. It has a consequence to it, but it is part of being human. And the reason I'm just thinking about my childhood and how when I was probably 6 years old, and my parents read the Bible to us, and all the Bible, and sex comes up a lot in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, in terms of just these patriarchal societies and just the exploits that took place. And so it came up at one point. I think either it was circumcision that came up or something like that. No, it was the fact, I think we were reading the story of Abraham and how his wife, Sarah at the time, couldn't have children. And so mom was like, well, let me just explain this to you. Like, it's in the Bible. I got to explain this in order to understand this story. So she just sat down and explained, like, how do people have babies?
That's pretty young, too.
It was pretty young, yeah. And then we had a series of books that kind of range in terms of what they covered, that over the years when we were old enough, our parents would take us aside one by one and read us these at that age that kind of walked through that. But yeah, just the point being that it's in the Bible. Like it's so much a part of human what it is to be human.
I think that's the issue, is that a lot of people, when they think of Christianity, you think of like very prudish society where this is never discussed, and yet it is mentioned a lot.
Oh yeah, there's talks of seed spilling on the ground. I mean, it's pretty vivid, actually.
That's right.
And
so then, I guess as a teenager, and I don't know how graphic we really want to get with this, but I guess my question is then, how does like self-pleasure, masturbation, that sort of thing play into the Christian household? Is that discussed, or is that...
It wasn't really.
Yeah.
No, yeah. Yeah, no, the idea of sex in terms of it being a way to produce children and existing within marriage was definitely discussed.
Sure.
But in terms of kind of the messier, no pun intended, ways of talking about that, or how that interplays, just wasn't... which meant there was a lot of guilt and a lot of uncertainty and confusion that took place. But what I will say is, growing up as an adult then in the church, those kind of conversations did exist with my pastors and with people that I trusted to a certain degree. So there was definitely a context for that. It wasn't like it was totally pushed under the rug.
That's right.
But growing up, we didn't. I knew my parents did it. didn't ever witness them doing it or
Great.
knew that they were doing it, but it was definitely like, yeah, we
Can
do
I
this.
just say,
This
as a very
talked
quick
about.
side note
Yeah.
here, I have so many friends who have horror stories, but either walking in on their parents or hearing their parents, and I am beyond thankful that never happened to me
It never happened
in my
either.
entire life.
I found a box of condoms in my dad's closet.
Oh.
Like that's the closest. I was
Okay.
like, okay, I know what this is for.
Yeah.
That's awkward.
They've had enough children.
That's right. Yeah, basically. But you talked about the kind of the guilt that comes about when, even in a society that says sex can happen, as long as there's consent.
Yes,
Right, so do
absolutely.
that. Consent-
I think consent, and
Consent's
that's like
the
the
new
buzzword
morality?
that is nowadays is consent.
Yeah.
And I think there's a portion of society that looks at that in a very negative light, where it's like, what, you have to like sign a contract before you even like introduce yourself to a woman. And
Yeah.
I've never looked at it that way. It's more of like, you are both on the same page that
Right.
this is something you both want to do, and you've checked to make sure that you both want to do this. So I watched this video like a couple years ago that really summed it up really good, which is consent is basically like being able to ask someone if they want to have tea or not, right? It's like, can you ask them? Can they respond?
Right.
That's basically the same thing. If they can't respond, or if they decide, you know what, I don't want tea anymore, then you don't have consent anymore.
We'll try to post the link to that video.
Yeah, I'll
in
try
the
and
show
find
notes.
it so that I can show it. But it's a really great video just to illustrate that that's all it's saying.
So
for that sort of thing.
it almost sounds like the morality. I don't like that word because I think it's come to replace true religion, as it were.
Sure.
But in the sense, the confines put around sexuality are consent. So as long as there's consent between two adults,
Sure.
anything's
Yeah, two
okay.
adults, that's very
right.
clear.
So two adults consenting, everything's okay.
Yeah.
Like that's kind of the
And I would agree with that.
Okay.
I
Why?
firmly believe that as long as it's two willing adults that are willing, that they want to engage in that, then I'd have no problem with
Sure.
them going and having a sexual act together.
So-
I don't think there's anything morally wrong with that. I
Right.
don't think there's anything culturally wrong with that. I may disapprove of the relationship if I think there's other things going on. which is
adultery
like,
kind of thing.
well,
or-
yeah, adultery is one of
Okay.
them, or even like if I think someone's being manipulated or whatever.
Sure.
I think there's some
Right.
ulterior motives that might be going on, that sort of thing. But the actual act of having sex, no, I don't have a problem with any
Right.
two adults having
Right.
that decision.
Right. Because what I want to get at, one of
Yeah.
my beliefs when it comes to sex, is that sex has consequences.
Oh,
That-
absolutely.
That
yeah.
sex is a huge part of what it is to be human, and that the act of sex can't exist in isolation, and that there are effects on the entire person when the sex takes place. And so, and an example, I think, of how that works is when you talk about the guilt that exists. Like, why is it then? I mean, is it more? I guess so. Yeah. Why is it that there's guilt still involved in terms of sex when even in a culture that morally says it's okay to do as long as there's consent?
Well-
Is that because there's older moral systems that are hanging on? Like,
I think that might
nettles?
be part of it. I honestly think, though, this all comes back to being open about what sex is and what to expect
Okay.
from it.
What's the mystery of it?
Yeah, because I mean, when you
So it's not in something that's actually inherent within sex itself. Like there isn't a sense of mystery within sex itself.
I don't think
that
so.
then
I mean, I think
it's a
when-
biological act.
Right. I think it's this. I'm trying to like rush an analogy through my head here, but it's like if driving a car was considered like the ultimate thing, right? You can drive this car, but then no one ever talked to you about it, and no one went through driver's training,
Right,
and no one
right.
actually told you how to
Right.
drive. And then you got in the car the first time and you ran into a stop sign.
Right.
There's gonna be a lot of guilt involved. Like, well, everyone else can drive. Why am I the only one who doesn't know how to drive this car? And I think that comes down to sex as well, where we don't want to talk about it. If we do want to talk about it, we just change the subject. Some churches believe that it's just only in marriage you should be having this. I think that there's a lot of cultural and community guilt that could be thrown into the act itself that just like obfuscates what's actually happening. If we had just a more open conversation about it, and not just like wear skimpy clothing or watch this like sexy person over here do something.
Right.
Like I don't think
So
porn in of itself is a great thing.
Why?
Because again, it gives us false expectations of what that act
Right.
is actually going to be like.
Okay.
we should be a lot more, we should be better at having that conversation. Like, this is what to expect. This is what should be happening. This is how you know.
So education.
This education is really what I'm trying to say.
So you say if there's better education, then that guilt and the mystery of it isn't the thing. I guess what I'm trying to get at is, you said that sex is an act of pleasure that's available to anyone as long as you're of age and of consent.
Correct.
And yet you also say that it has a purpose beyond that. That it's
Yeah.
designed to knit people together.
Yeah,
in a
it's
sense,
like
right?
it's like eating. Eating, you can be very nutritious and build like a strong body, or I can have some ice cream if I want to have some ice cream today.
Okay.
Because I deserve ice cream. Dang it.
But there's no rules governing eating ice cream, is there?
There is not. No.
Right. And yet,
ice cream does not have to give consent to me eating it. That is right.
Does the cow who gives you the ice cream?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. 'Cause I guess you talk about the mystery. I guess what my worldview is saying is that, both of those things are true in the sense that it does give pleasure, but there is like just training. Even if you were to have, you think of some Huxley world of dystopian where everyone's trained on, everyone does it in the closet in full view kind of thing. There still is a mystery to it. There still is something more going on behind these things. And the same is true of eating. Like, eating is a part of life. I think it's very different than sex because there's different rules governing that. But there's also something really beautiful and about sharing a meal with someone that changes things.
Sure.
that just that something else doesn't.
You can share it with someone else.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is that there's something. I believe in a world that's shot full of the transcendence. That these physical acts do have a great meaning and do have great purpose, and that something more is going on. Sex is beautiful, it's good, but it's potent and it's dangerous. Like there's just like cars. There's certain rules governing it that are actually part of what it means to be human, and that there's consequences for sex, and in the sense that and I think that's where a lot of that mystery and guilt and confusion comes from, is because we tend to recognize that something more is going on when a couple has sex together that unites them in a physical way, but also in a spiritual way, in a way that gets the essence of who they are.
Yeah, and I guess I just don't have that spiritualness that I'm including within that. I do believe that, yes, this is a coming together of us both, I guess in more of a humanistic way, where like we are exchanging ourselves with each other.
It's just
and we're honoring ourselves with each other, but we're not necessarily including like anything else inside of there.
Right.
I thought I was going to save this story that I want to tell for a later episode, but I think I should tell it now just because it's germane to the conversation. And that is my first sexual experience. And I'm not going to go into like graphic detail. Don't worry.
We're going to get like a rating for this podcast.
That's right. This is a TVMA. This has just happened. But the very first time that I had sex, I really wish I could do it over again, because it just was an awful, terrible thing that happened. And it happened in a hotel room, of all places. And
it's where most Christian couples have sex for the first time. So,
is that true?
I think so. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
They rent a hotel after their wedding.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay, gotcha. That's like, is there some like sort of like secret sex cult in the church that I don't know about?
No.
Okay. So,
yes.
So basically, what happened is that I started messaging this guy online, and we decided to meet in this hotel room. And the problem was that I tried to pretend that I was a lot more knowledgeable about it than what I actually was. This is going to be my very first time. So, we go there. I'm super nervous. Things start happening. And I just got so kind of upset and weirded out by this situation. And he got mad. And then he kind of just left pretty angry, slammed the door, and left through it. And I just remember this like moment of me like sitting on that bed in a hotel room, and like nothing of I don't know, repute surrounding me. Like it was just like this strange room. It was silent, and me sitting on the bed. I'm like, I never want to go through that experience ever again. Yeah. Like I just felt so worthless and awful. There's like, like, is this what it is all the time?
Right.
Is like this what I'm destined to have for the
Right.
rest of my life? And it turned out it wasn't. I've had other relationships since then that there was a lot better communication
Yeah.
that went on between the two people involved. But I just remember that first time, if that's what a lot of people experience, I definitely sympathize with them for thinking that like that's what it has to be or that's what it is, because there wasn't more communication going on inside the relationship.
So you're saying that the consequences, what you felt after that, wasn't necessarily a result of the fact that it was sex,
Yeah,
but
the
it was
actual-
because of the communication problems.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think the expectations that had been set between us
Right.
at that point.
So it comes down to the fact that for you it's purely biological.
I mean, a portion of it. I mean, the thing is I just don't think it's spiritual. That does not mean that I think that it's just a physical act. It's just a biological act to make us feel good. I think that there can be a transcendence that happens while having sex.
Right.
I just don't
Is that
think
just because of the pleasure, that transcendence, or is there?
I think it's the pleasure, but coupled with the person that you have there with you.
Yeah,
I
this
think
knitting together.
I think going back to your meal analogy, yes, you can cook a meal for yourself, or you can cook a meal for your family, or you can cook a meal for someone that you deeply care about, because you don't care about your family, Daniel. No, but you know what I mean. Someone that you're romantically interested in, and it could be the same meal you're preparing for each of those different instances, and it can taste and be different because of the people that
And
you're
that's
sharing that with.
True as well of sex, in the sense that you can.
I think,
okay.
that's what I do believe that.
Okay, so there's it's more about the circumstances rather than it's about the act itself.
Correct. Yeah.
So when there's, I mean, I've never had sex. I'm a virgin because I believe that it should be safe.
I was going to assume that.
yeah,
but I
yeah.
didn't want
I have no stories to share, except
right.
of yeah.
You should read it on Wikipedia.
That's right. Well, no, but the idea of but you watch. I love. There's films. I can't remember too many explicit examples of this.
It's called Dirty Dancing.
The one that I am thinking of is Terrence Malick's To the Wonder.
Oh gosh.
Remember the affair scene that takes place where she
Yeah,
goes up in
yeah.
the hotel and there's a real sense of guilt.
Yeah.
And consequence that comes to that scene. But there are other films that depict that with a sense, or books. There's something more is going on, something between these two people that is uniting them in a sense that that doesn't happen in any other way. Like there's that sense of deep connection you can have with a person.
So you
over
mean
a
that
good
they're having an affair,
conversation.
but there's a deep conversation, or that they're having
No.
sex and there's a deep
There's a deep
connection?
connection, yeah. When they're having, like, the act of sex itself
I mean-
creates a deep bond.
I don't know why this is the very first one that pops to mind. You're going to laugh at me, but the very first one that pops to mind is Titanic, of all movies.
I'm laughing at you.
Where
I've never seen Titanic.
Yeah, two single people, but they have this like climactic moment, let's say, in the back
Some
of a car
steamy-
on the Titanic. But it does feel like there's something more, like they're destined to be lovers for the rest of their lives.
Right.
Spoiler alert, he dies. But but you know,
That's just the tip of the iceberg.
I think you're right. I think there's so many different movies out there that are basically the love story in that is that yes, these people are good looking, but they're also destined, or they're supposed to be together.
But I guess what I'm getting at is
there's
that
something deeper connecting them than just two attractive people being in a movie.
I guess what I'm trying to hint at is the sense that when a couple has sex, that there is a sense of bonding that's happening that is more than just that has consequence for that relationship, and that I guess and that's why for me, like, the idea of I believe that because I believe that sex in the Bible is designed for marriage, and that a husband and wife coming together that are knitted together in a very physical way, that they're made for each other in that way. So I'm doing things with my hands that suggest
this is
the
great
act.
for an audio podcast.
That's right.
Daniel.
Yeah. But that's because in the sense that act of union and that act of joy that comes from that is a sign of love for the other person. But in a deeper sense, the Bible talks a lot about how marriage is a picture of Christ and the church. And so this idea of even sex representing that in a certain way, like in Jesus was asked at one point, he says, like, I had this, they were trying to stump
What's
him.
to do with sex, yo? I believe is what the exact quote was.
Pretty much. But no, he was asked what happens to a family that marries a person that marries 5 times because his wife keeps dying. Who will be his wife in heaven? They're trying to show him. He's like, there will be no marriage in heaven. And at first, that's kind of like, well, okay, that's a disappointment. Like, I was looking for, especially if you're in love and about to get married, which I'm not. But in the sense that then later on, when you think about that, you go, well, that's because Christ is now with his church together. So the point of the example that is marriage and sex is no longer necessary because the higher reality that it is pointing to has been achieved.
Yeah, I guess the biggest conflict that we're going to have with this is that marriage is, I guess, somewhat of a stepping stone to have that higher reality. Like
Sure.
you're having this marriage under Christ, yes,
Yeah.
but the ultimate eventuality of your life is that you'll be in a place where there is no marriage, where you're married to
Right.
Christ himself
Right.
instead
Yeah.
of with your partner that you
Yeah.
have. And my takeaway is that your marriage is that you are making a very deep commitment to someone here and now on this earthly plane, and that is the commitment you're making here, that there is no afterlife after
Right.
this, that you want to make sure that you are honoring them as much as possible here.
Right.
So I don't think we're actually necessarily opposed as far as sex goes so
Sure.
much as far what we are opposed with is why sex
Totally.
is important
The
in the
belief
first
behind
place.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to talk about sexuality though for a little bit, and why I think
Could I ask
Sure.
another question first before
Yeah.
we tackle that? When it comes to, so you're talking about how consent is the only rule, and that it's just an act with consequences, but
Yeah.
nonetheless it's an act. And then there's also hints of adultery is not a good idea.
No.
There's hints of porn might not be a good idea. There's definitely things about how consent.
Yeah,
there is no consent. There is
let me
nothing.
be very specific.
Or children. I guess I'm trying to say is that
yeah.
it sounds like there's these. Yet, even though you don't believe in moral constraints, there still are moral constraints because of the potency of the act itself.
Yeah, yeah. I think, again, it all comes down to communication, expectation, and I guess understanding why you're having sex in the first place. Yes, I have no problem with people having sex just for the sexual gratification that it provides for them. On the flip side of that, I think that pornography, if that is your only window into what sex is very damaging,
Why is that?
because it is giving you such an improper expectation of what that act is like that will probably never be fulfilled by your romantic partner. And for the vast majority of it, it is deeply misogynistic, which I have a big problem with as well.
So it's education again, in a sense. It's training you wrong.
Right. It's actually causing bad things to happen in our society when you go into a relationship thinking that my wife is supposed to do this for me,
Yeah.
when that is such an unrealistic expectation to have anyone
Right.
have that for you. Plus, it also goes back to like sex is really only for guys and not for women, and that's a
Right.
whole other
Totally.
conversation
Yeah,
that
yeah.
I think
Which
is
isn't
really wrong-headed
Yeah.
for the most part.
Yeah.
Having said that, I've heard tell that there is feminist porn out there, which is better. I don't know. I don't really partake in it all that much, so I'm not the best person on that. And then, even though I think that two consenting adults can have it, I think because you have made a commitment to someone, whether it's in a dating relationship or in a marriage relationship, that you should honor that. And I'll be the first one to admit, and this is one of my deep shames, that there was a relationship that I was the person who committed the infidelity. So I'm not like squeaky clean in this.
Yeah.
And I learned a lot about myself because I didn't think I was that person, and it turned out I kind of was. So it's something I always have to keep myself in check with.
So it's more about the commitment to the other person then.
Yeah.
But there is a sense in which the sex, because so there's no rules surrounding it except the rules that you're making for it, because there is a potency behind it, there is a power behind it for that relationship. So then to cheat on that is to destroy that relationship because of
absolutely.
what it means for that. Yeah. Huh.
So, sexuality.
Fascinating.
Destination, and I'm coming home real soon.
Hi, everyone. This is Kyle breaking into the conversation to let you know a couple of things. First, Assumptions is brought to you by the Alberta Podcast Network, powered by ATB. If you haven't gone to the Alberta Podcast Network's website, you really should. So many great shows to browse through. For instance, there's Desktop. This is a podcast where hosts Mike and Rob focus on the intersection between how we use technology and how it affects us. If you want something a little more than a couple of guys yelling about the latest in tech, Desktop is the podcast for you. Check it out and all the great shows by going to albertapodcastnetwork.com. We are also brought to you by the ATB. They not only help to fund the Alberta Podcast Network, but they also help to fund this program. If you want to see all the different initiatives and programs that are available to you, go to the website atb.com/listen. That's atb.com/listen. Okay, I guess it's time to get back to the sex. I'll talk to you again at the end of the episode. And here's what I'll say, because I think sexuality has become, again, much more important in modern society in the last few years, just because more people have been able to share their stories.
Right.
It's not that, 2012 happened and people started suddenly saying, hey, by the way, we have to add more letters into LGBT. And they just made it up. These people have existed for years. They just could not actually come out and tell their own stories in this case. So I find it endlessly fascinating, the whole sexuality question.
Yeah.
And
you're part of
learning
that
more
community,
about
right?
that.
As someone who's
And-
bisexual, you're more conversant in that. And
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's something that we'll talk about this more when you tell your story on our next episode, and then I respond to that. But I think that there's been way less listening by people like me
Sure.
to that kind of thing, because there's a lot of pain and there's a lot of frustration. There's a lot of, I'm looking forward to next episode just doing a lot of listening
Yeah.
and asking questions.
If you want a good primer on this, there is a book you can buy. It's by a YouTuber that I happen to think is really good at this sort of talk, but it's called The ABCs of LGBT.
I've heard of
And
this.
it kind of just goes through literally all the different orientations and identities
We'll
that
link to it
people
in the
have. And we can link to that in the show notes as well. So if you're just interested, you can definitely look at that, which I think you can even get a free copy of the book, if I'm not mistaken. I don't want to make that promise, but I'm pretty sure that's true. Anyways, I'm not going to go through every single aspect of sexuality.
Sure.
Why I think it is important for people is precisely because it hasn't been talked about.
Okay.
If this had been something that was open and everyone could just say, by the way, I'm bisexual, by the way, I'm asexual, or I'm pansexual, or whatever it happens to be, for the last 5,000 years, then yes, we could be in a situation where, like, nah, you know what, it doesn't really matter. No one really cares.
there hasn't been enough listening, is what you're saying.
Exactly.
Right.
Because this gets into a lot of cultural theory and sort of thing. But the default for so many relationships is it's heterosexual man and woman.
Yeah.
And I think because that's not the reality for so many people nowadays, that it's just them saying, hey, no, I need to make this demarcation so that when I say my partner
Right.
or however you want to phrase that, it's like if I say my wife, I don't have to be like, oh, my roommate in quotes and I are going and doing this thing, or I can say my wife or my husband, depending on what sex I am, to like bring them up to equal footing of other relationships. So I think it's just being able for other people to be able to be true to themselves and say, this is actually who I am, and I want to make it okay for the people that are listening to this who think that they have to hide it, to let them know, by the way, this person that's in this position is this way. I could sing Lady Gaga's Born This Way, but I will refrain from it, Daniel. I don't know, what's your reaction to that, I guess?
Well, it's something that I wanted to talk more about when we get to hearing your story and the reaction to that, because I think it's one of those things that when it's divorced from a person, it can be very easy to be judgmental.
Sure.
When it comes down to a friend, someone that you know and love, that is telling that story of this is how this has affected me, that's a very different context, and that's the way it should be, because I do think we're people made in the image of God. Like, that's where this ethics applies to people. These kind of moral standards, this kind of worldview applies to people.
I think not the downside, but I think the thing that you're going to push back on is because none of those, I'll say, non-traditional relationships, I don't like that phrase, but I'm going to use it.
Sure.
Those non-traditional relationships are things that cannot be consecrated in marriage officially by most of the churches. in North America and Europe is that they can never honor God appropriately inside those unions. So I understand that they are
an accurate reflection.
Correct. Yeah,
right,
that's what you're.
That heavenly reality.
Sure.
Sure. But that doesn't mean that those kind of desires don't exist. One of the guests that we are going to have on this program is Wesley Hill, and he's someone who identifies as gay, and he is a celibate Christian because he just says, I identify this way, I struggle with this, but I cannot believe that it's permissible for me as a Christian. And what he says is that what he gains by his faith and by his identity in Christ is more than what he would have gained through his gay identity and living that out in terms of however he thinks he wants to. And then he also says that because I'm being transparent, I mean, I'm putting words in his mouth, but from the books I've read, the impression that I'm getting is that he is transparent, his transparency about what it's like to have those identities and to be in a church and reckon with that out loud strengthens the whole church, because they realize who this person is and they realize what this person's struggling with, and they can come alongside him in ways that he can't otherwise. So I think that's one of those things that as a consequence of these identities being talked about and stories being shared, is that we get to know people better and we get to listen to their pains, and it's a rounder, fuller picture of humanity. Even if I don't think that that taking advantage of those in however way you want is permissible. Does that make sense? The difference between struggling with that.
This is who I am, but not
what I will be.
Yeah, right.
In terms of what I will act upon, right? Like I could, and I think there's Tim Keller, one of my favorite pastors, has an illustration of this where he says, if you look at a Viking back in the day when Vikings existed,
1940s, yeah,
back in the Middle Ages,
yeah.
And this Viking has two tendencies: he likes to kill and loot and destroy, and he's attracted to guys. His culture is going to say, attracted to guys bit, not cool. The loot, destroy, all that, hey, you can go ahead and do it. Here's some monasteries, have fun. If you go to the streets of Manhattan and you have somebody and his desire is to kill, loot, and destroy, and his other desire is to have sex with guys, our culture says, hey, the cool loot and destroy bit, not cool. Don't do that. Have sex with guys, go right ahead. Yeah. So the sense that, and I guess that's where it comes down to identity and desires, like, that we all have desires. I have desires to do things, that I'm not going to act upon those desires. Maybe I should be in an environment where I can express those desires and reckon through that. But I'm still going to have some sort of confine, either that I'm putting on myself or that society puts on me to act upon that. And which ones of those desires to act upon.
I guess I understand the analogy that they're putting. I have a little bit of an issue with equating sexuality with murdering people and robbing people, but I still understand where the analogy is coming from. Again, because I don't have that I guess Christianity bedrock of like, this is right, this is wrong, sort of thing. It feels like there is conditional love being placed on people in a certain way. Although this also goes back to talking about morality in general. We had that conversation last season too, which is why is it okay to do this but not okay to do this? Society's kind of changed over time with what we consider right and wrong. Yeah. And currently today, most places that you go to in North America, being gay is okay. Like we've kind of accepted that. I grew up in a time where it was not. No. It was the majority of people did not think it was okay, and I only got snippets of that culture thrown at me through popular culture. Most of it negative. Only a couple times of it being positive. But those positive representations had such a deep effect on me. Right. For me to not feel completely and utterly alone. So I think that it's important for us to still listen to people and champion their stories. And I just think that we should celebrate the multicolored rainbow that we have in our world. And I know that sounds kind of like, I don't know, artsy fartsy or floofy and stuff like
tapestries of people.
The tapestries of people. I feel that when we start telling people that this way that you have no choice in, that you're born and you're attracted to these people, that you either shouldn't say that or you should just push that down and never act on it your entire life, is just more damaging than it is helpful.
Sure.
in the long run. And I'm fairly certain what your rebuttal would be that is that you just have to let God in your life. But at the same time, I think even doing that, even doing that is just, I think, more psychologically damaging than.
I guess what I don't know if I'd bounce back to that right away.
Yeah.
I would again echo the sense that there are desires we're not going to act on.
Yeah.
There just are, right? Like I'm in the sense of like maybe I'm not going to pillage, loot, and destroy, but if I'm attracted to some person and I'm married, should I act on that? No, right?
No,
like
no,
so.
yeah.
I guess that's what I'm trying to say is there's confines. I guess what I'd come back to is the sense that while I agree that sex is important and it's an important part of being human, I don't think that acting upon that desire is necessary to be human. So as someone, in the sense that, so I'm a single guy, I'm not married, I don't have sex. Does that make me less of a human? Does that give me psychological damage because I can't do that? Well, there are consequences. Like maybe I'm more lonely. Maybe I have more physically. There's times where I want to let it out. Right. There's that aspect of it. But I don't think that I'm less human because I'm not listening to those desires. I have those desires. There are things I want to do sexually that I don't think I'll ever be able to do just because I don't agree with it. Doesn't mean I don't have those desires, but it does mean that I'm still fulfilled as a person in other ways.
Yeah, no, and I can decide on that, and I don't think it makes you less human not to have sex. I guess on the reverse end of that, I also don't think it makes you less human to be, say, like a gay man involved in a gay relationship.
Yeah.
So
I agree with that. No, I agree with that.
There's this like weird teeter-totter effect I think we're going back on, that we're kind of agreeing with each other. We're just disagreeing on I don't know, the scale. I don't know how else to put it.
Well, the other thing, I mean, we'll talk. I urge our listeners who are mad at either of us at this point, especially those that are mad at me.
This is the great thing about our podcast, in that everyone who's on my side thinks I'm not hard enough on Daniel, and everyone that's on Daniel's side thinks that he's not hard enough on me. So.
But I guess what I would urge is that this conversation alone should not exist in isolation. I've talked a lot about hearing your story, but I haven't yet. I mean, as a friend, I have, but in terms of this podcast, because we're going to talk about that next episode. It's going to be all about your story. And there's stuff I want to say about the church's response to people that are identifying those ways that has been very unchristian, that I'm going to be talking about in the subsequent episode. So there's a lot more here that I want to include.
Yeah, that's the big thing. We are actually having the Anglican Church as our guest next episode.
I guess there's that. And I do think that the other thing that I'll just throw out there is that what's true for the church and for Christians isn't necessarily true for culture, although I think there are consequences. So that being said, like I don't think, like you said, the flip side of that, like someone who is acting out sex in a certain way is then considered less human. No. I think I support, in that sense, I think I almost do support gay marriage from a society's perspective. I'm fine with that. I'm just not, it's different when it comes to the church.
Marrying in the church and stuff like that.
Yeah. What about identity? So the sense that we kind of hinted at that in the last little bit of our conversation, but I guess one of the things that, I'll just throw this out, that kind of frustrates me about our society's way of looking at it is that, or maybe that I question about even your story, even though we haven't heard that as a podcast yet. But the sense that until I find myself as bisexual and act that out, my identity is incomplete.
Yeah, that's a hard one to answer, because I don't know if it's necessarily the acting of it out. Like going back to Wesley Hill. Yeah. Going back to Wesley Hill. Yeah. He is a gay man who has never acted out or doesn't act out on his sexuality. I would still classify him as a gay man in that case.
He does, right?
So I think identity is important because it's able to clarify maybe your own self and your own urges. Sure. Because to give a prelude of my story, until I kind of had that switch flip and be like, oh, it's because I like both. That's why I'm confused all the time. It just clarified things to the extent like, I get it. Okay, that makes sense. Much the same way, I don't know, different things will clarify for other people. I think it's very similar to like I identify as Canadian, whereas someone who was born in France is going to identify with that. You're going to identify with the culture, with the country, with the people that you grew up with, for good or for ill, depending on where,
right.
where it is.
It still is helpful.
But it still is helpful to clarify,
Right.
like, my point of view is shaped because of all of these things.
Right.
And I think that my point of view is absolutely shaped because of my own sexuality.
Right.
Is that the only thing? No.
Sure,
I don't.
sure.
And that's also... This is also a very longer conversation that we can get into at some other point. My issue with pride a little bit is that I think that pride overall is a good thing, but I also think that it sometimes glorifies the wrong aspects of the identities.
What do you mean?
I think that in many pride parades, it's been co-opted to like almost like flaunt sexuality. And again, I'm no prude. Like, I don't care if you show a little bit of skin. That's not the point. But I also don't think that should be
The point.
my defining way that I define myself.
Right.
It's like if I identify as a gay man, it's like, but I'm not the gay man who goes and just wears like a Speedo in Times Square. Like, I am a gay man. I want to be happy that I am, but I'm like the
Next decade.
maybe it's like I'm like the lame gay guy who just wants to like sit in my house and watch Netflix. That's just what I want to do.
That's okay. Yeah. So you're saying that the confines that word isn't associated with this expression of it.
And I think that
than
in
a
some ways that
fuller
almost
human expression.
hurts the cause in some ways, because the people who are the most adamant of like rejecting that completely, it's like, oh, that's what all gay people are like. And it's like,
but that's true of evangelicals,
that's one aspect of it. And exactly.
Yeah, right? I technically am evangelical. I don't identify with the evangelical culture because I think that for other reasons it hurts. It's not an accurate reflection of them and of that belief. I guess identity is something that I think we've mentioned a little bit on the podcast already, but how identity can become so quickly your reality and how there's actually more to that. And I guess what I'm saying is that sexual identity, meaning sex itself and the act of sex and the desires of sex, aren't what makes someone human. And it's not what makes someone Christian. It's not the primary reason. It's not the primary thing in a Christian's life. Yeah. For Wesley, we'll hear about this when we interview him, but his identity in Christ supersedes his identity as a gay man.
Well, I think that
he's still gay.
Again, I think this is the important thing. I guess for you, is being a Christian the most important part of your identity?
And I would clarify that in saying that being a Christian, being Jewish, being Muslim, whatever that is, for me, it's not so much the cultural thing. I go to church, I was baptized, that kind of thing. It's that my identity has its stability in who Christ is and what Christ has done for me. I find myself in Christ and what he's done. I find my hope in the fact that he loves me so much that he stepped in to save me. And so then when other identities that I have that are important, right? How I dress, what kind of things I like to do, the kind of people I like to be. Those are all identities that I think are very valuable. They're what makes me human. But when those crumble, which they inevitably will, I've lost positions at work before. That was an important part of my identity. You get sick or you don't do well in school, all these different things, then your identity crumbles away, and what's left and what gives stability is what can't be changed, and that is how I prove myself, how I have my self-worth, what I do is not in me. It's in what Christ has done for me.
I guess it's, the only counterpoint I guess I would have to that is that from my point of view, it's somewhat similar where my sexuality, my ethnic background, those are also two things that cannot be changed. They don't just inform my outlook on the world, but they also are something that will never change with me either. So it's something that is always there front and center. The only thing being is that I agree with you in part is that sexuality does not need to be my only defining characteristic. And in fact, I don't consider it my most important aspect. It's on the top 5, let's say, but it's definitely not like the one that I lead with. There's so many other things that I do. What I don't necessarily have is that prism that you're looking through, which is like, I'm doing this because of X. And maybe I'll have that someday. It's just, it's like I have a bunch of stuff that I hold dear, that I kind of use as my worldview.
Yeah, and coming back to our beginning, we talked about we're humans. We're made as physical flesh beings. So sex matters, and sex has consequences, I believe, because we're not just souls and we're not just flesh and blood. we're a combination. But just coming back to the idea of like, I was just thinking as you were describing I'm like, well, what happens if your balls get chopped off? like those, like, is your gay identity still part of you then? And then I was realizing as I was thinking that, like, that's a stupid sense of it's so extreme. It's like it's like the Hitler thrust of this argument. What about Hitler?
I know.
What about your balls?
Like,
but in the sense of
by the way, every internet comment chain will inevitably have Hitler mentioned every single time.
Exactly. We just did it on our podcast. Yeah. But in the sense that if that were to happen, you're no less human. Like that doesn't change your identity for someone in my worldview. And yet, that's not how we were made either. That's abnormal. We were made in the image of God, and we were made to have sex, and so that's part of who we are as well. There's this. There's a pendulum. And right. You can't go to one extreme. You have to have a balance between the two.
Yeah. The biggest thing that I'm saying here is I think that why sexuality is at such the forefront of so many people right now is because it's been hidden for so long. And so I think they're just bursting open at people saying, no, let's pump the brakes.
Right.
There's all of these different things, and I need to make sure that I am true to myself.
Right.
I love the idea that in like 100 years, 400 years from now, it just won't be a big deal.
Right.
But I just don't think we're there yet.
Right. Yeah. Well, this is a fascinating conversation. It was the time where I think we disagreed maybe the most.
Maybe.
I don't know.
It's weird. I don't think we necessarily disagreeing. Yeah. I just think we're disagreeing in the, I don't know, the overarching concept of why we're doing it.
Yeah, that's what's fascinating is that what you said at the beginning, pleasure and for companionship, as it were. I agree with that. It's just the why behind it.
The why behind
it.
And
it is, you get a lot of times in Christian worldview studies, people say, look, if you believe there's no God, if you believe we're evolved monkeys, it'll change. And in this case, it kind of does, actually, right?
Sure,
like you believe in certain differences of morality because you don't believe you have a different conception of what it is to be human. Yeah. Can you have sex with monkeys? That's another question.
How about monkey robots? Is that okay?
That's in Japan, so.
This is a great, fascinating topic.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that people do send in their own comments. We mentioned last episode that you can send in your own voice memos if you want to the assumptionspod@gmail.com email address. Daniel, how else can people follow you on the internet?
Yeah, my website's a good place where I tend to throw things up on. DanielMelvilleJones.com. Melville, Melvill. And then before we lose our audience, just one more time, the conversation's not over yet. Our next episode will have your story and a chance for us to listen and respond. And then the next episode is going to be talking a little more about how the church has responded to LGBTQ+. I'm dyslexic, so I apologize.
Barbecue, LOL, WTF.
There you go. What about you? How can we find you?
TheKyleMarshall.com is the website that you can go to, or follow me on Twitter. I'm at TheKyleMarshall. That's Marshall with 2 L's. Assumptions is produced by Kyle Marshall and Daniel Melville Jones. This episode edited by Kyle Marshall with help from Josh Boak. Artwork by the always great Chris Taniguchi. All the music in this episode is from the band The Parson Redheads. You can check out their music anywhere digital music is available. Once again, huge thanks to the contributors that you heard at the beginning of this episode. Full credits will be given in a later podcast. Thanks for listening to the credits. We'll continue this conversation in a couple of weeks. Author Joy Beth Smith.